Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Oxygen Pharma. I am Marianne Kyriakos, and today we're going to be discussing a very crucial relationship in business, the relationship between the landlord and the tenant, and how to negotiate a very good lease. Stay with me. For today's episode, we will be focusing on how to negotiate a good brand new lease. And so for those who took over a lease because they purchased an existing pharmacy, many of these terms were already negotiated and you probably have very little room to renegotiate these terms with the landlord. Let's start. Let's take a look at the three documents that we see when we're trying to negotiate a lease. There's a letter of intent, there's an offer to lease, and there's an agreement to lease. Sometimes landlords use all three, sometimes they only use the agreement to lease. The letter of intent. The letter of intent is like a promise ring. One individual gives a promise ring to the other, telling them they're not going to see other people and that they're committed, but it's non-binding. Then there's the offer to lease. The offer to lease is a binding agreement that sets out the terms between the two parties. That's more like your engagement ring. However, there is a clause in the offer to lease that the landlord usually puts in there that indicates that in the event that the terms in the offer to lease conflict with the terms of the agreement to lease, the agreement to lease prevails. Which brings me to my favorite document, the agreement to lease. That is your marriage between you and the landlord, or your corporation, your pharmacy and the landlord. In the agreement to lease, it dictates all the obligations and all the rights clearly between you and your landlord. It is fully binding, and that is where you want to get to with the landlord when you are in negotiation. You want at the end to have a fully executed agreement to lease between you and the landlord. The first part of a lease are the parties to the lease. There's the landlord, there's your corporation that will be owning the pharmacy, and then there is you. I don't recommend that you include yourself personally in any lease. You should always incorporate and have that corporation sign the lease with the landlord, even in the event that you sign the lease in trust for corporation. Again, there may be exposure to personal liability if you do so, and so I always recommend that you incorporate and then go ahead and have that corporation sign the lease. I also recommend that you always try to negotiate that you not be a personal indemnifier under the lease. Sometimes the landlord will demand that you personally indemnify the landlord in the event of any breach of the lease. I highly, of course, recommend that you try to negotiate yourself out of it. The reason being that if there is an issue with the lease and the landlord, and you're not included in the lease, then the landlord goes after the assets of your corporation. However, if you are a personal indemnifier, then the landlord can go after your personal assets. And so unfortunately, because of COVID, many businesses have been affected and many businesses have gone out of business. As a result, many commercial spaces are now for lease, and it has become a tenant's market. And your chance to negotiate the best terms possible for your business, it is important that you do so now, because in 10 years, when your lease is over, the landlord will definitely be having the upper hand. Now, in terms of negotiating the terms of your lease, you of course want to negotiate a lease that is long enough, but also that does not lock you in for longer than required. Nowadays, banks will not fund the purchase of a pharmacy without at least a 10-year lease. However, you need to be thinking of the future. You need to be thinking of your future plans for your pharmacy, which most likely will be at a certain point selling the pharmacy. And in doing so, you have to negotiate at least a 10-year lease. But not only that, options. This means that you negotiate a 10-year lease where you are locked into the lease for 10 years. However, you also negotiate 2 or 3 options of 5 years each. They give you the option, just you, the tenant, to extend your lease if you choose to do so. Another important clause that you must include in there when you are starting a brand new pharmacy is a rent-free period. That rent-free period allows you to construct the pharmacy, to get the pharmacy ready prior to having a soft opening and opening up the pharmacy. So you don't want to be paying rent during that time. I recommend that you negotiate 3 months at least of a rent-free period. Sometimes the landlords prefer to give you a contribution instead of the rent-free period, either or, but that must be included in your lease. Also, don't forget that your term of the lease should always start once you actually have possession of the premises. If the landlord is doing their own construction and you don't even have access to the premises, you should not be paying rent for it. Now the section on the use of the premises. You have to indicate in there the exact use of the premises. Do you want to use it as a pharmacy and medical clinic? Are you going to be dispensing methadone? Are you going to have a methadone clinic in there? You need to indicate everything upfront in your lease. Exclusivity, very important to have this clause in your lease. Even if you are the only pharmacy right now, you don't know about later throughout the years. I do know of a case where the pharmacist did go ahead and lease premises from a landlord without negotiating an exclusivity clause. At the time, there was a grocery store. That grocery store left. Another grocery store came in, and that grocery store had a pharmacy in it, and there was no exclusivity clause, and so that person did lose a lot of his business. So be careful with that. The next point I'd like to discuss is the landlord's assignment and consent of the lease. A crucial clause in the lease. Why? Because at the end of the day, after all these years and after building all this goodwill, you do want to be in a position where you can sell your pharmacy and you don't want the landlord standing in your way. And so you do need to include in there that the landlord's consent cannot be unreasonably withheld. And in the event that it is withheld, or in the event there are any issues pertaining to the consent and assignment, that you do have resources and that you can go ahead and take that landlord to arbitration, or that you can sue that landlord. And the last few points I'd like to raise is the demolition clause. The demolition clause basically gives the right to the landlord to go ahead and demolish the entire building with you in it in the event that he sells it to a developer who requires demolition. And so, of course, I highly recommend that you negotiate that the landlord not include or not be allowed to demolish the premises. But in the event that the landlord insists on a demolition clause, which is somewhat common these days, you do have to include that he is not to demolish prior to the first 10 years at least of your lease. And the last 2 points I would like to raise is, first, an arbitration clause. You should always include that in your lease. Arbitration, you have 2 options basically in the event that you have a conflict with the landlord: arbitration or civil litigation. Civil litigation takes much longer, it's a lot more expensive, versus arbitration. It is a shorter timeline and decisions are made faster and in a more economic manner. So I always recommend an arbitration clause in there. And finally, due to the times that we're in, I recommend that you negotiate a clause that forgives your rent in the event that, of course, you shut down, you're forced to shut down by our government, or if you are part of a medical clinic and the pharmacy depends highly on the traffic of the medical clinic, but the doctors are working from home and seeing their patients via telephone, and you are suffering as a result, then I recommend that you have a clause in there that mandates that the landlord forgives or reduces your rent. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I covered a few points in this episode, but this episode does not replace personalized legal advice. Thank you very much. I encourage you to send me your questions and maybe I'll be able to answer them on our next episode. Thank you.